They called it the Floating Chrysanthemum, a nickname for the aircraft carrier Akagi that spoke of both beauty and imperial pride. On the dawn of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on its flight deck, watching as the first wave of Japanese bombers and fighters spun up their propellers. The rising sun cast long shadows across the steel deck as pilots made final adjustments to their Zero fighters. None of them knew they were about to fly into one of history's most decisive naval battles, one that would transform them from hunters to prey in the span of just 6 fateful minutes. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. For months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated the Pacific with near impunity. Pearl Harbor had crippled American naval power. The Philippines had fallen. The British fortress of Singapore had surrendered in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Japanese pilots soared through Asian skies with supreme confidence, their Zero fighters possessing a mystical reputation for invincibility. But on this early June morning in 1942, something was different. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet, had conceived a complex plan to eliminate what remained of America's Pacific naval power, particularly its aircraft carriers that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor. The plan centered on Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategic American outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Victory disease, as Japanese military historians would later call it, had infected the Imperial Navy's high command. A string of unbroken successes had bred a dangerous overconfidence. The Americans were on the run, demoralized, and outmatched, or so the Japanese believed. Admiral Yamamoto, despite his brilliance, had constructed an unnecessarily complex battle plan that dispersed Japanese forces across a vast expanse of ocean. His main carrier force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, approached Midway from the northwest with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Uhiryu, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. What the Japanese didn't know, what would prove catastrophic for them, was that American cryptanalysts had partially broken the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. The Americans knew they were coming. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga was the leader of the first attack wave against Midway. At 4:30 that morning, he stood with the other pilots for final briefings. At 36, Tominaga was considered old for a combat pilot. Respected by his men for his experience and calm demeanor, he had already seen combat over China and at Pearl Harbor. His dark eyes were steady as he studied the reconnaissance photos of Midway's installations. "Our mission is simple," he told his pilots. "We will neutralize the American air base on Midway to prevent any counterattack against our carriers." The unspoken assumption hung in the air. American carriers were nowhere near Midway. Intelligence reports had placed them near Hawaii or even heading toward the Aleutian Islands, where a Japanese diversionary attack was underway. By 4:45 a.m., Tominaga climbed into the cockpit of his Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber, modified for this mission to carry bombs instead of torpedoes. Alongside him, 107 other aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and horizontal bombers, prepared for takeoff. The roar of engines filled the pre-dawn darkness as, one by one, the aircraft raced down Akagi's flight deck and lifted into the sky. The air crews were the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Many had been flying together since before the war, honing their skills through years of rigorous training. The Zero pilots, in particular, had an almost mythical status. Their aircraft could outmaneuver anything the Americans had encountered thus far, with a climbing rate, turning radius, and range that had shocked Western observers. Petty Officer First Class Shigenori Nishikaichi was one such Zero pilot, launching from the carrier Hiryu that morning. At 22, he embodied the spirit of the Japanese naval aviator, supremely confident, skilled, and devoted to the emperor. He had already scored several kills in the opening months of the war and wore a white silk scarf given to him by his mother. Like many Zero pilots, he viewed his aircraft as an extension of himself, light, agile, and lethal. As dawn broke over the vast Pacific, the strike force headed southeast toward Midway, climbing to 12,000 feet. Below them, the endless ocean glittered in the early morning sun. The flight to Midway would take over an hour, giving the pilots time to contemplate what lay ahead. For many, thoughts turned to home. Ensign Takashi Morinaga carried a photo of his young wife in his flight jacket pocket. They had married just 3 weeks before he shipped out with the fleet. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto silently recited a Buddhist prayer taught to him by his grandfather, who had been a pilot in the Russo-Japanese War. Each man had his ritual, his talisman against the uncertainty of combat. When Midway's small islands appeared on the horizon, the strike force began its descent. American radar had already detected them, however, and Midway's defenders were ready. As the Japanese planes approached, they were met by a small but determined force of American fighters, obsolescent Brewster Buffaloes, and a few Grumman F-4F Wildcats that rose to meet them. The ensuing air battle was brief but fierce. The superior Japanese Zeros quickly overwhelmed the American defenders, shooting down most of them while losing only a few of their own. Yet even as this aerial victory unfolded, the Japanese bombardment of Midway proved less effective than hoped. American installations were dispersed and well protected, and the Japanese bombs did not neutralize the airfield. As Lieutenant Tominaga led his bombers back toward the carriers, he radioed a fateful message to Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This simple communication would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of the Pacific War. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a crucial decision. His carriers had already prepared a second wave of aircraft, armed with torpedoes for attacking American ships should they appear. Now, he needed to decide. Should he rearm these planes with bombs for a second strike on Midway, or maintain them ready for any American naval forces that might be discovered? Even as he deliberated, Japanese scout planes were searching the surrounding ocean. One pilot, Warrant Officer Amari from the cruiser Tone, was running behind schedule due to catapult problems. His delayed launch would prove devastating to Japanese fortunes. Back on the flight deck, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida watched with growing concern. Normally he would have led the first attack wave, but appendicitis had grounded him for this mission. Now, as Nagumo's air staff officer, he observed as the Admiral ordered the second wave aircraft to be rearmed with land attack bombs instead of torpedoes. At 7:28 a.m., just as this complex rearming operation was underway, the delayed scout plane sent a chilling message. 10 ships sighted bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles. Seems to be enemy. 10 minutes later came the clarification that froze every officer on Akagi's bridge. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo immediately reversed his decision, ordering the planes to be rearmed again with torpedoes. But this process would take time, precious time the Japanese didn't have. The flight decks of all 4 carriers were now scenes of controlled chaos, with returned aircraft being refueled, ammunition being restocked, and bombs and torpedoes being exchanged. Unknown to the Japanese, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were already launching their strike aircraft. The hunters were about to become the hunted. For the Japanese pilots who had just returned from the Midway strike, there was little time to rest. Many remained in their cockpits or near their aircraft, drinking water and eating rice balls provided by the carrier's galley. Some helped the deck crews rearm and refuel the planes. The earlier confidence had given way to a quiet tension. Lieutenant Tominaga sat in his cockpit, writing notes about the Midway defenses for the second attack wave. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, his flight suit damp under the strengthening tropical sun. He knew another mission would be coming soon, though he didn't yet know its target. Petty Officer Nishikaichi used a cloth to wipe down the canopy of his Zero. The fighter had performed flawlessly over Midway, and he had scored another kill against an American Buffalo. He chatted with his plane captain, a young sailor responsible for maintaining the aircraft, about minor adjustments to the engine timing. The relative calm of this moment belied the approaching catastrophe. At 9:20 a.m., the first American attack came in the form of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet. The slow, vulnerable aircraft approached at wave-top height, making them easy targets for the combat air patrol of Zeros circling above the Japanese fleet. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant tactical air commander, directed the Zero fighters to intercept. All fighters Vector 180 Angels Zero torpedo planes approaching. His calm voice belied the urgency of the situation. What followed was slaughter. Zero fighters, piloted by veterans like Lieutenant Masashi Kano and Petty Officer Nishikaichi, tore into the American torpedo squadron. One by one, the slow-moving Devastators were shot down. Of Torpedo Squadron 8's 15 aircraft, not a single one survived. Only Ensign George Gay lived through the attack, floating in the water to witness what came next. Similar fates befell the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. The Japanese fighters were in their element, diving on the American aircraft, their 20mm cannons and 7.70mm machine guns cutting through aluminum skin and flesh with equal ease. By the battle's end, 35 of 41 American torpedo planes had been destroyed without scoring a single hit. The Japanese pilots radioed triumphant reports back to their carriers. Lieutenant Kano's voice crackled over the radio. "Enemy torpedo planes destroyed. No hits on our ships." Cheers erupted on Akagi's bridge, but the American sacrifice had not been in vain. The Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level to intercept the torpedo planes. The skies above, at 14,000 to 20,000 feet, were now virtually undefended, and it was from those heights, out of the sun, that disaster struck the Japanese carriers. At 10:22 a.m., lookouts on Akagi suddenly shouted warnings. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, were pushing over into their attack dives. Almost simultaneously, another group of Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, appeared above Soryu. For the Japanese pilots still on the flight decks, men like Tominaga and Fuchida, the next minutes unfolded with nightmarish clarity. The American bombs fell with deadly accuracy. 3 struck Akagi, including a direct hit that penetrated to the hangar deck where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed. Kaga was hit by at least 4 bombs. Soryu took 3 direct hits. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were transformed into flaming infernos. On Akagi's flight deck, Lieutenant Commander Fuchida was thrown off his feet by the first explosion. When he regained consciousness, the scene around him was apocalyptic. The flight deck had buckled upward from internal explosions. Burning fuel poured through ruptured pipes. The air was filled with thick black smoke and the screams of wounded men. "Abandon ship! All pilots to the destroyers!" The order came as fires raged out of control, threatening the ship's magazines. For the elite Japanese aviators, the most humiliating moment of their careers had arrived, leaving their burning carriers behind, their aircraft destroyed before they could even engage the enemy. Lieutenant Tominaga never had the chance to abandon ship. He was killed instantly when an American bomb detonated near his aircraft on Akagi's flight deck. Petty Officer Nishikaichi, who had been in the air with the Combat Air Patrol, returned to find his home carrier, Hiryu, the only survivor of the American attack. Commander Genda, severely injured by bomb fragments, was forcibly evacuated from Akagi. As he was loaded onto a destroyer, he watched in disbelief as the pride of Japan's carrier force burned. "How could this happen?" he whispered through pain-clenched teeth. The surviving Japanese pilots now faced a new and terrifying reality. With 3 carriers gone, only Hiryu remained operational. Its commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi immediately launched a counterattack against the American carriers. The weight of Japan's response now fell on the shoulders of the remaining pilots. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led Hiryu's dive bombers toward the American fleet. Among the Zero escort pilots was Petty Officer Nishikaichi, flying his second combat mission of the day. The strain showed on his young face as he climbed into the cockpit, his earlier confidence replaced by grim determination. "Find the American carriers," Admiral Yamaguchi ordered. "Sink them at all costs." At 12:05 p.m., the Japanese strike force located USS Yorktown. The ensuing attack damaged the American carrier severely, forcing her to stop dead in the water. For a brief moment, it seemed the Japanese might salvage something from the disaster, but American intelligence had been tracking Japanese communications. They knew Hiryu had survived and launched a final strike against it. By late afternoon, dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise found and attacked Hiryu, scoring at least 4 direct hits. Japan's last carrier at Midway was transformed into a burning wreck. As night fell on June 4th, the human toll of the disaster became clear to the surviving Japanese pilots. Of the elite air crews that had launched that morning, many would never return. Those who survived found themselves homeless, their floating airfields destroyed. Petty Officer Nishikaichi, after the attack on Yorktown, had returned to find Hiryu already hit and burning. Low on fuel, he was forced to ditch his Zero near a Japanese destroyer, which picked him up from the water. As he sat, wrapped in a blanket, on the destroyer's deck, he watched Hiryu burn against the darkening sky. The carrier would sink during the night, taking with it Admiral Yamaguchi, who chose to go down with his ship. For the first time since the war began, Japanese naval aviators faced the bitter taste of defeat. The mystique of invincibility that had surrounded the Zero and its pilots was shattered. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and 322 aircraft. More devastating was the loss of over 100 irreplaceable, experienced pilots, men who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. Commander Minoru Genda, recovering from his wounds aboard the cruiser Nagara, summed up the disaster with painful clarity. "We had lost not only our carriers, but our finest pilots. A defeat in ships can be overcome with construction, but the loss of our veteran airmen is irreparable." As the remaining Japanese ships retreated westward under cover of darkness, the surviving pilots faced an uncertain future. Many would be reassigned to land-based units or to the remaining carriers in the Japanese fleet. All knew that the nature of the Pacific War had changed fundamentally. The Americans, once thought inferior in both equipment and fighting spirit, had proven themselves formidable opponents. Their intelligence had outwitted the Japanese. Their pilots had pressed home attacks with incredible courage. Their dive bombers had struck with deadly precision. For men like Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the symmetry was painful. The same carriers that had delivered Japan's greatest triumph now lay at the bottom of the Pacific, victims of American vengeance. As dawn broke on June 5th, the survivors gathered on the decks of destroyers and cruisers to perform a solemn ritual. Facing in the direction of Japan, they bowed toward the Emperor, thousands of miles away. Then they bowed toward the smoke still visible on the horizon, the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. For the elite pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Midway marked the end of offensive dominance in the Pacific. The psychological impact went beyond the loss of ships and aircraft. For the first time, they had experienced what their enemies had felt for 6 months, the helplessness of watching their floating homes burn and sink beneath them, the humiliation of rescue by support vessels, the bitter taste of defeat. The sun that rose on June 5, 1942, illuminated a Pacific battlefield transformed. Admiral Yamamoto, upon learning the full extent of the disaster, quoted a famous Japanese poem, "Mountain cherry blossoms, scattered by the wind, like snowflakes. So, too, had Japan's finest naval aviators been scattered in an American storm. The floating chrysanthemums had sunk, and with them, Japan's hope for Pacific domination. 3 weeks after the disaster at Midway, Lieutenant Masatake Okumaya sat alone in the officers' quarters at Rabaul Air Base in New Britain. Rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof as he carefully penned a letter to the family of his friend, Lieutenant Tominaga. "Your son died as he lived," he wrote, "with honor and courage in service to the Emperor." The words felt hollow, insufficient to capture the magnitude of what had happened. Okumiya paused, brush suspended above the paper, as his mind returned to the terrible reports from the survivors. How could he tell this family that their son had perished on a carrier's deck, never even given the chance to face his enemy in the air? How could he explain that the invincible combined fleet had been outmaneuvered and outfought by an enemy they had been taught to despise? For the surviving Japanese naval aviators, the aftermath of Midway brought harsh new realities. The Imperial Navy's rigid hierarchy made it difficult to acknowledge mistakes or learn from defeat. Official reports minimized the disaster, claiming that American losses were greater than they actually were. Operational difficulties was the euphemism used to describe the catastrophic loss of 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft. Commander Genda, still recovering from his wounds in July 1942, submitted a detailed analysis of the battle to Naval Headquarters. His report was unflinching. "Our defeat was not due to American superiority in materials or fighting spirit, but to our own errors in planning, intelligence, and tactical execution." The report disappeared into the bureaucracy, its uncomfortable truths too painful for many senior officers to accept. For the pilots who had survived, reassignment came swiftly. The need for experienced aviators was desperate. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Zero pilot who had flown from the carrier Akagi, found himself transferred to the carrier Shokaku. "When I arrived," he later recalled, "I was shocked by what I saw. The replacement pilots were mere boys, with perhaps a third of the flight hours I had when I first deployed. They could barely land on a carrier deck." The training program that had produced the world-class aviators of the Pearl Harbor attack had been dramatically abbreviated. Before Pearl Harbor, a Japanese naval pilot received up to 700 hours of flight training before being considered combat ready. By late 1942, new pilots were being sent to the front with less than 200 hours, many of them in obsolescent training aircraft. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who served as an instructor after Midway, was blunt in his assessment. "We were sending these young men to their deaths. They knew it. We knew it. But there was no alternative. The psychological impact on the surviving veterans was profound. Men who had once dominated the skies of the Pacific now found themselves outnumbered, flying increasingly obsolescent aircraft against improving American models." Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi, who had flown from Hiryu at Midway and survived, wrote in his diary in September 1942, "Today I shot down an F-4F. The American pilot was good, much better than those we faced 6 months ago. They are learning while we are teaching with the blood of our best men." By the end of 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had been transformed. The Americans had seized the initiative, landing at Guadalcanal in August. The brutal fighting there would become known to the Japanese as the Island of Death. For Japan's naval aviators, it represented a new kind of horror, fighting from austere island bases without the support systems they had known aboard their carriers. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's second highest scoring ace, arrived at Rabaul in August 1942. He found conditions appalling compared to carrier life. "We slept in tents that leaked in the tropical rain," he later wrote. Food was poor and medical care primitive. Aircraft maintenance suffered from lack of proper facilities, yet we were expected to maintain the same standard of excellence as before. The toll on the pilots was evident in their declining performance and increasing fatalism. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had survived Akagi's sinking, noted during an inspection tour in late 1942, "The spirit of our pilots remains high, but their eyes have changed. There is a hardness there, a resignation. They fly each mission as if it were their last, because increasingly it is. This fatalism manifested in a marked increase in Toko suicide attacks long before the formal organization of the kamikaze units in 1944. Lieutenant Fusada Ida had set the precedent during the Pearl Harbor attack, declaring he would crash his Damage Zero into an American installation rather than return in failure. After Midway, such incidents increased. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who commanded a Zero unit at Rabaul, reported with concern, "3 of my pilots in the last month have chosen to dive their damaged aircraft into American ships rather than attempt water landings. They saw no future in continuing the fight, only in ending it on their terms." The Japanese naval leadership, desperate to reverse the deteriorating situation, pushed their remaining elite pilots to the breaking point. Combat rotations that should have lasted 3 months stretched to 6, then 9. Pilots routinely flew 3 or 4 combat missions per day, their reflexes dulled by fatigue, their bodies weakened by tropical diseases and poor nutrition. By early 1943, the consequences of this attrition strategy were becoming clear. American intelligence estimated that 90% of the naval aviators who had been in service at the start of the war were now dead. The replacements were undertrained and overmatched against increasingly experienced American pilots flying improved aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. The few surviving veterans of Midway became almost mythical figures to the new pilots. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, recovered from his wounds, was assigned to reorganize the Naval Air Training Program in 1943. "When I visit frontline units," he wrote to Admiral Yamamoto, "the young pilots gather around the veterans like disciples around a holy man, seeking wisdom that might keep them alive for another week." One of those veterans, Lieutenant Yokoyama, described a haunting encounter with new replacements at Truk in April 1943. "A young pilot asked me how many missions he should expect to fly before being killed or wounded. When I asked why he wanted to know such a thing, he replied, 'I want to know how many Americans I need to kill to repay my debt to the Emperor before I join my ancestors.' I had no answer for him." The technological gap between Japanese and American aircraft also widened rapidly after Midway. The A6M0, revolutionary in 1940, was increasingly outclassed by 1943. Its light construction, which gave it maneuverability and range, also made it vulnerable to the heavily armed American fighters. Without self-sealing fuel tanks or adequate pilot armor, the Zero became known as a flying lighter for its tendency to burst into flames when hit. Lieutenant Masanobu Ibasuki, who had flown from Zuikaku during the Battle of the Coral Sea and narrowly missed being at Midway, wrote with increasing frustration in his letters home, "We beg for new aircraft with armor and self-sealing tanks like the Americans have. The response from headquarters is always the same. Japanese spirit will overcome American materials." By mid-1943, Japanese naval aviators faced a cruel equation. Their life expectancy in combat continued to decrease as American strength increased. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, who would later command Japanese carrier forces at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, recognized the impossible situation. In a private memo to the Naval General Staff, he wrote, "We cannot produce pilots of adequate quality in sufficient numbers to match the Americans. Each month, the disparity grows worse. We are asking these young men to accomplish the impossible." The impossible was exactly what was expected of them. Lieutenant Yoshiro Hashiguchi, a Zero pilot who survived from Pearl Harbor through the Solomon Islands campaign, described the psychological burden. "Each morning I looked at the mission board and counted how many of us would not return that day. The only question was whether I would be among them. We flew with the knowledge that our deaths were mathematically certain. It was only a matter of which day." As 1943 progressed, the survivors of Midway found themselves in increasingly desperate situations. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had been Nagumo's air staff officer aboard Akagi, was assigned to organize the defense of Rabaul. I have 42 operational aircraft to defend against daily raids by 200 American planes, he reported to Tokyo. My pilots fly until they collapse or die. The human cost became unsustainable. Lieutenant Tadashi Minobe, who had been rescued from the waters near burning Kaga, wrote in his final letter home before being killed over Rabaul. We who survived Midway carry a special burden. We have already lived longer than we had any right to expect. Each day is borrowed time, yet we must set an example for the new pilots who have so little chance. The battle for air superiority in the Solomons and New Guinea during 1943 decimated what remained of Japan's elite naval aviators. By the time of the American invasion of Tarawa in November 1943, the situation had become critical. Captain Masafumi Arima, commanding naval air groups in the region, reported, "Of the 192 pilots under my command, only 7 have more than 300 hours of flight experience. The Americans can replace both aircraft and trained pilots. We can replace only the aircraft." Captain Arima would later exemplify the desperation of Japan's naval air arm when, in October 1944, he personally led a suicide attack against the USS Franklin, becoming one of the first senior officers to do so. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented the final destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. In 2 days, over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down, many piloted by trainees with barely enough skill to take off from a carrier deck. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, one of the few surviving Midway veterans participating in the battle, described the slaughter. It was not combat, but execution. Our young pilots flew directly into the American combat air patrols, with no understanding of tactics or evasion. I watched 17 aircraft from my own unit disappear from the sky in less than 5 minutes. The technological disparity had become overwhelming. Commander Masatake Okumiya, by then serving as Air Staff Officer for the Combined Fleet, noted in his battle report, American fighters could climb faster, dive faster, and outrun our Zeros in level flight. Their pilots communicated constantly by radio, coordinating their attacks, while our pilots fought as individuals. It was as if we had brought swords to a battle against machine guns. The few remaining veterans of Midway who survived until late 1944 became instrumental in the organization of the kamikaze special attack units. Lieutenant Commander Asaichi Tamai, who had flown from Hiryu at Midway, helped establish the first formal kamikaze unit in October 1944. When asked about the morality of sending young men on one-way missions, he responded, "Since Midway, all our missions have been one-way. We are merely acknowledging what has long been true." By early 1945, Japan's naval air arm existed in name only. The survivors of Midway, who had somehow endured nearly 3 years of increasingly hopeless combat, found themselves ground-based, flying obsolescent aircraft against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, ended the war leading a fighter group defending the home islands, flying the outdated Zero against American B-29 bombers. As the war drew to its inevitable conclusion, the human legacy of Midway became clear. Japan's decision to continue offensive operations after losing its elite pilot corps proved catastrophic. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who survived to become one of Japan's leading post-war military analysts, wrote, "Midway destroyed not only our carriers, but the flower of Japanese naval aviation. The decision to conceal the extent of this disaster, rather than learn from it, only ensured that the sacrifices of those men were ultimately futile." For the Japanese pilots who survived Midway, the day of June 4, 1942, remained burned into their memories as the moment when victory became impossible. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, in his post-war memoir, recalled watching American bombs strike Akagi. "In those few seconds, I saw not only our ship's doom, but my country's. We had awakened a sleeping giant at Pearl Harbor. At Midway, we felt the full weight of his vengeance." The personal cost to these men extended far beyond the war. Many survivors struggled with what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi, who survived from Hiryu, returned to Japan with severe burns and psychological trauma. He wrote in 1952, "I still wake in the night, smelling burning aviation fuel and hearing the screams of my friends trapped below decks. We who returned carry the spirits of those who did not." The psychological burden was compounded by Japan's post-war reluctance to confront the realities of the conflict. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe, in his 1977 memoir, described the frustration. "For 30 years, I could not speak of what happened. When the war ended, we were first condemned as militarists, then forgotten as an embarrassment. The truth of our experiences, the courage, the suffering, the mistakes, was buried with our dead comrades. For many of the survivors, the most painful legacy was the knowledge that their sacrifices had been largely unnecessary." Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, in a 1969 interview, acknowledged, "Midway was a battle that need never have been fought. We gained nothing by attempting it and lost everything. Had we maintained a defensive perimeter and husbanded our strength, the outcome of the war might not have changed, but thousands of our finest young men might have lived." Perhaps the most profound perspective came from Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who became a leading historian of the Pacific War. In his final work, published shortly before his death in 1996, he wrote, "The tragedy of Midway was not just the loss of ships and men, but the loss of Japan's opportunity to end the war before it became a conflict of annihilation. After Midway, Japan fought not for victory, which had become impossible, but from an inability to accept defeat. This cost millions of lives on both sides." The last surviving Japanese pilot from the Battle of Midway, Warrant Officer Kazuo Tsunoda from the carrier Kaga, died in 2013 at the age of 96. Before his death, he gave a final interview to NHK television. "We were told we were invincible. At Midway, in just a few minutes, we learned we were not. That knowledge came too late for Japan, too late for so many of my friends who never returned from the Pacific. If there is a lesson in our experience, it is that military power without wisdom leads only to destruction." Today at the Maritime Self-Defense Force Officer Candidate School in Itajima, Japan's Naval Academy, the Battle of Midway is studied in detail. Cadets learn not only the tactical failures, but the human cost of overconfidence and strategic rigidity. Commander Keiichi Nakahata, who teaches naval history at the Academy, explains, "We teach Midway not to dwell on defeat, but to understand how critical decisions, once made, can have irreversible consequences. The pilots who flew that day were among Japan's finest. Their courage was never matched by the wisdom of their leaders." At the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where Japan's war dead are commemorated, the names of the pilots lost at Midway are inscribed alongside all of Japan's fallen warriors. Each year on June 4th, a small ceremony is held by the dwindling number of families who still remember. They bring white chrysanthemums, the symbol of mourning, but also the flower that gave the carrier Akagi its nickname. An elderly woman, the daughter of Lieutenant Tominaga, who led the first attack wave, attends each year. In 2019, at the age of 83, she told a journalist, "My father died before I was old enough to remember him. All my life he has been a photograph in uniform, a medal in a box, a name on a tablet. What I learned as I grew older was that he was caught in forces beyond his control, a single man swept up in the currents of history." This sentiment perhaps best captures the tragedy of the Japanese pilots at Midway. They were elite warriors, trained to perfection, committed to their cause, yet they became victims not only of American bombs and bullets, but of their own leadership's strategic miscalculations and unwillingness to adapt to changing realities. When the Pacific War ended in September 1945, only 16 of the original Japanese carrier pilots who had participated at Midway remained alive. Their average age was just 28, but most looked decades older. their bodies bearing the scars of burns, crash injuries, and tropical diseases. Their eyes carried the haunted look of men who had watched an entire generation of comrades perish. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had survived the sinking of Akagi, became the most well-known of the Midway survivors. After the war, in a surprising turn of events, he converted to Christianity and spent much of his later life as an evangelist, traveling to the United States, the very nation he had attacked at Pearl Harbor. Before his death in 1976, he reflected, "At Midway, I lost my ship, my comrades, and my country's future. But in that loss, perhaps there was a seed of something better, a Japan that would find its greatness not in conquest, but in peace." Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had helped plan both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, took a different path. He joined the newly formed Japan Air Self-Defense Force in 1954, eventually rising to the rank of general and serving in Japan's parliament. Until his death in 1989, he maintained that Midway had been winnable, if only better reconnaissance had been maintained, if only the strike against the American carriers had been launched immediately, if only the Japanese combat air patrol had been positioned at higher altitude. "What haunts me," Genda wrote in his 1979 autobiography, "is not that we lost, but how close we came to winning." The difference between victory and catastrophic defeat came down to 10 minutes. The 10 minutes when our carriers were caught with fuel lines exposed and bombs on deck. For Japan, the legacy of Midway extended far beyond military defeat. The loss of so many elite pilots forced a fundamental shift in tactics and training. By 1944, with qualified instructors scarce and fuel supplies dwindling, pilot training had been cut to less than 100 hours, barely enough to take off and land safely. This desperation directly led to the kamikaze strategy, where minimal pilot skill was required for a one-way suicide mission. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who had become a key architect of kamikaze operations, carried the weight of this transformation. In post-war interviews, he spoke with deep regret. "After Midway, we were caught in a spiral of diminishing returns. Each lost veteran pilot meant poorer training for the next generation. By 1944, we were sending young men with barely 40 hours of flight time against American pilots with 400 hours. The kamikaze was not our chosen strategy. It was our only remaining option." The technological stagnation of Japanese naval aircraft after Midway further compounded the crisis. While American industry rapidly developed improved fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair, Japan's A6M0 remained fundamentally unchanged. Captain Minoru Suzuki, who headed a fighter development program in 1944, explained the paralysis. "We could not afford to interrupt production for improvements. Every suggestion for better armor or self-sealing fuel tanks was met with the same response. We need numbers, not quality. American bombs are destroying our factories faster than we can redesign our aircraft." The human stories of those who survived Midway into the war's later years reveal the psychological trauma of fighting a losing battle. Lieutenant Masanobu Ibusuki, who lived until the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, wrote increasingly fatalistic letters home. "We no longer speak of victory. We speak only of how many Americans we can take with us when we die. My dreams are haunted by the faces of new pilots who arrive each week. I know they will be dead within days, yet I must lead them into battle with false confidence." Perhaps most poignant were the final writings of those veterans who, near the war's end, joined or led kamikaze units. Lieutenant Commander Asaichi Tamai, a Midway survivor who helped organize the first formal kamikaze unit, left behind a revealing diary. "The young men who volunteer ask me if their deaths will bring victory. I cannot tell them the truth, that victory is already impossible. I can only assure them their sacrifice will be honored. In this, at least, I do not lie." The contrast between the elite aviators who fought at Midway and the hastily trained kamikaze pilots of 1945 represents the full arc of Japan's aerial defeat. Commander Genda noted this bitter symmetry. At Pearl Harbor, our pilots returned to their carriers victorious, having lost only 9 men. 3.5 years later, we were deliberately sending hundreds of young men to certain death. There is no more damning indictment of our leadership's failure. For America, the lessons of Midway were clear and quickly implemented. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, ensured that the intelligence triumph that had made the victory possible was expanded and refined. The combat experience gained by pilots who survived early battles became the foundation for improved training and tactics. For Japan, the lessons went unlearned until it was far too late. The Imperial Navy's culture of secrecy and face-saving prevented an honest assessment of what had gone wrong. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi, in his post-war writings, described this institutional blindness. Even as we pilots could see we were losing the air war, our reports were edited to maintain the fiction of victory. Maps in command centers showed defensive perimeters that no longer existed. Losses were minimized. American casualties exaggerated. We lived in 2 worlds, the real one where we fought and died, and the imaginary one that existed in official reports. This disconnect between reality and reporting had deadly consequences. Based on falsified reports of Japanese successes at Midway, the Imperial General Headquarters continued offensive operations that stretched dwindling resources even thinner. The Guadalcanal campaign, launched just 2 months after Midway, squandered the lives of many remaining veteran pilots in a battle that Japan could not sustain logistically. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who served at both Midway and Guadalcanal, captured this frustration. After losing 4 carriers at Midway, any rational strategy would have been defensive consolidation. Instead, we attacked again immediately, throwing our remaining trained pilots into another meat grinder. It was as if our leaders believed they could erase Midway by winning at Guadalcanal. All they accomplished was to finish what Midway had started, the destruction of our naval air power. By early 1943, the consequences of this strategic blindness were becoming apparent even to junior officers. Lieutenant Yoshiro Hashiguchi noted in his diary, "Today, we received replacement pilots who have never fired their guns at a moving target. They have never practiced aerial combat maneuvers. They can barely find their way back to base using navigation. Yet tomorrow they will face American pilots with hundreds of hours of training and combat experience. This is not war, it is sacrifice." For the Japanese naval aviators, the period between Midway and the end of the war represented a descent into increasingly hopeless combat. They watched as American technical and numerical superiority grew month by month. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda described this psychological burden. "We knew precisely what was happening. We could count the increasing numbers of American aircraft, measure their improving performance, observe their pilots' growing skill. Yet we were forbidden to acknowledge these facts officially. This cognitive dissonance, knowing the truth but being unable to act on it, created a particular kind of despair. This despair manifested in different ways. Some pilots, like Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, channeled it into ferocious determination, fighting against impossible odds until the war's end. Others surrendered to fatalism. Lieutenant Masanobu Ibusuki wrote in April 1944, "I no longer fear death because I have accepted its inevitability. This strange calm has made me a better pilot. When every mission is assumed to be your last, precise fuel calculations and return plans become irrelevant. You focus entirely on finding and destroying the enemy." As Japan's defensive perimeter contracted through 1944 and 1945, the few surviving veterans of Midway found themselves defending the home islands. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who had once flown from carriers against distant enemies, ended the war intercepting B-29 bombers over Tokyo. In his final wartime report, he wrote, "We have come full circle. We began this war striking enemy territory from the sea. We will end it defending our own cities from above them. The journey from Pearl Harbor to the skies over Tokyo measures our defeat." The psychological impact of this defeat created complex post-war legacies for the survivors. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's conversion to Christianity represented one path to reconciliation. Others, like Commander Genda, channeled their energies into rebuilding Japan's defensive capabilities in alliance with their former enemy. Some, like Lieutenant Masataka Okumiya, devoted themselves to historical analysis, determined that the lessons of defeat would not be forgotten. Perhaps the most profound transformation came in Japan's strategic culture. The suicidal offensive spirit that had led to Midway was replaced by a deep caution and pragmatism. When Lieutenant Okumiya became an architect of Japan's post-war defense policy, he insisted on a fundamental principle. Japan must never again mistake tactical brilliance for strategic wisdom. The pilots who died at Midway were tactically superb but strategically doomed. No victory is worth pursuing if its cost exceeds its value. In the 7 decades since Midway, the battle has been extensively studied by military academies worldwide. American analyses tend to focus on the intelligence triumph, the courage of American pilots, and the decisive nature of carrier warfare. Japanese studies emphasize the human factors, the pressure placed on Admiral Nagumo, the overconfidence of the planning staff, the irreplaceable nature of the lost pilots. Commander Keiichi Nakahata of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force Academy observes, "What makes Midway eternally relevant is that it demonstrates how quickly advantage can shift in warfare. At 10:20 that morning, Japan was winning the Pacific War. By 10:30, the war had been lost, though it would take 3 more years and millions of lives to reach its conclusion. For the families of the Japanese pilots lost at Midway, the battle remains a private grief nested within a national tragedy." Keiko Yamamoto, whose father, Lieutenant Jisaku Yamamoto, was killed aboard Kaga, expressed this perspective at an 80th anniversary commemoration in 2022. "My father was 26 when he died. I know he was brave and skilled, as were all those young men. But what I have come to understand is that courage and skill are not enough when sent in service of flawed strategy and unreasonable goals. This understanding, that individual excellence cannot compensate for strategic failure, is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Japanese experience at Midway." The pilots who flew from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu on the morning of June 4, 1942, represented the pinnacle of naval aviation at that time. Their Zero fighters could outmaneuver any American aircraft. Their training was superior, their experience extensive, their fighting spirit unquestioned. Yet by day's end, their floating air bases had been transformed into flaming pyres. The attack that was meant to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific had instead begun the irreversible decline of Japanese air power. The hunters had become the hunted, and would remain so until the war's bitter end. As the sun set on the smoke-stained horizon on June 4, 1942, the surviving Japanese pilots could not have fully comprehended how completely their world had changed. But as the months and years passed, the significance of that single day grew ever clearer. Midway had not merely been a battle lost. It had been the moment when victory became impossible and defeat inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe, in the final interview before his death in 2007, offered perhaps the most fitting epitaph for his comrades. "We were the fortunate ones. We survived to see the peace that followed war, but we never forgot those who fell at Midway. They were the best of us, sacrificed in a battle that should never have been fought, pursuing a victory that could never have brought lasting peace. Their true memorial is not in conquest, but in the hard wisdom Japan gained from their loss."